Who do you think ends up making the big I can't believe they pulled that off move by the deadline?
I mean, the safe money is always on the Golden Knights, isn't it? I mean, it
Yeah.
just feels like.
Let's bring in Chris Johnston of The Athletic, TSN, The Chris Johnston Show. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. How are you guys this morning?
Lovely. Lovely as always.
Built like a
I
mini
get,
fridge.
Oh, no.
yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
to know the
That
story
just-
there, actually.
2 days in a row, my entire day has been thrown for a loop based off of what happened to me at the gym. Yesterday, it was forgetting that I had a temporary tattoo on my lower back as a tramp stamp and being in the locker room. And today it was being called a mini fridge by a stranger and having to unpack that.
What kind of gym are you working out at? Maybe you need
this is why we don't go to the
a
gym.
fresh setup there.
Yeah, I need to just get a different place, build a gym in my own house and never leave.
Okay, well, Chris, we're going to do a lot of trade stuff here, I suppose, and I know that we'll hit on JT Miller. I do want to quickly just ask, do you think the teams that are going to be active at the trade deadline from a seller's standpoint are different than what we thought they would be? We kicked around yesterday. Should the Blue Jackets really be moving an Ivan Provorov, and should the Canadians really be moving a David Savard? Are the players going to be different than we might have expected?
Well, I think certainly we have the conditions where that's definitely possible. With the surge Montreal's had, in particular, since around the holiday break, I do think it does at least present management with a different set of circumstances looking at it. Because I don't think, while they might have liked their team entering the year, I don't think they necessarily thought they'd be where they are now. And they can still let it play out a few more weeks before you have to decide firmly one way or the other. But they make sense. I mean, does a team like Ottawa end up buying a little bit if they stay in the race? I mean, especially in the Eastern Conference where there's just such a cluster of teams in sort of the wild card position or chasing those spots, I think that there could be some volatility there. But then again, there's a team like the Pittsburgh Penguins who I think are basically selling whatever they kind of have to sell at this point, regardless. So, there's probably a variety of approaches here. And what makes this whole trade deadline period unique is you have the Four Nations face-off break. And, based on the conversations I've had with people who are going to make decisions on trades, it really feels like you won't see any until after that break. And so, play resumes February 22nd and you have a March 7th trade deadline. It might basically just be a concentrated 2-week window where ultimately the biggest decisions are made.
Let's park it on the Penguins for a little bit. Like, do you actually see them having a path to retooling on the fly? Do they have enough assets that hold value for them to be able to do that?
It feels like a long shot. I wouldn't, I'll put it this way. I wouldn't necessarily saw Washington being where they are now. I would have thought that, post Ovechkin, post Backstrom, the guys that were part of their great run in their cup in 2018, that they wouldn't be able to bounce back. And so I guess on the optimistic side, you at least have some proof of concept that it's possible. But the problem for Pittsburgh that I see is they don't yet even have the next generation in house. I mean, they've just started to make some top, picks. They're going to amass that prospect pool. In the short term, of course, their priority is actually to trade for NHL players. They're not looking to dump off, a Marcus Pettersson just to get a first round pick, which, it's a pretty long window, generally speaking, before that pick actually becomes a player for your team. They're going to try. I don't know if it's possible. It feels a little bit like a suicide mission on some respects. But I mean, this is what Kyle Dubas signed up for. I mean, it's rare that a GM gets a 7-year deal as he did, or GM president in his case. And so it was done with sort of a wide window to try to maneuver. And they're going to attempt to do it. But, I'm a little bit skeptical just because we're probably looking at their third straight year out of the playoffs. And they still don't have, as I mentioned, that next generation that's willing to push them up. The 23 to 26-year-olds that are changing things in Columbus right now, for example, Pittsburgh just doesn't have those players.
Yeah, the retooling thing, just you need to have either a bunch of young players coming like the Capitals did, or you need to, we talked about it yesterday, have a situation like Boston did a couple of years ago where David Krejci just basically comes back for free and you're gifted players. So I think we can all agree the Penguins' mission right now is maybe a little unrealistic. So should there be more players on that list that we saw yesterday, which was basically they're going to trade everybody except for Crosby and Malkin and anybody who actually might have value? Should they actually be looking at those real pieces?
I think that conversation comes in the summer. And, it's probably too soon for me to say where that lands. But, you're not moving a Crosby in season. I don't think there's any circumstance where he would let that happen, where they even want to broach the subject. Like it's just off the table entirely until they played their last game of the 24-25 season. And then, I think you look at where you're at and, maybe they get to a point, or maybe he gets to a point, specifically Crosby, because I think he's the most appealing piece there, even for other teams, if they ever did choose to move him, and you go from there. But in season, you're going to do what you can. You move players like Marcus Pettersson. I know, Drew O'Connor. There's certainly players on their roster that I think they're going to be able to trade out. But you're correct in assessing. It's probably not going to be foundational shifting moves, and I think that those ultimately, if they ever happen, will be summer decisions, and we still got a few months till summer.
Do you see any scenario in which a team takes Erik Karlsson?
I think it's possible. Probably again, not in season, just given he's currently got a $10 million cap hit attached to him. My understanding is the Penguins don't want to look at retaining salary on someone with multiple seasons like Karlsson has. Now, again, they may get there in a larger context in the summertime, depending what that trade looks like. But the reality is that the cap does put a lot of safeguards in place, or whatever you want to call it, put restrictions in place for the kind of you know the moves I think fans crave don't happen in the season because they're just so hard to do with the math. And so Karlsson, I think there's a world he's moved, but again, I would be really shocked if that happened by March 7th.
How do you think the JT Miller saga plays out? Is there a scenario in which he ends up staying with the team? Because watching them the other night, I was like, man, he can be a difference maker if they can just all get along. But has that ship sailed?
They haven't ruled it out internally, but I feel like it's sailed, right? I mean, it's dangerous if you're in the GM's chair and you're saying we're 100% doing this, because you might be committing to making a bad decision then. And obviously the fact they haven't moved them 6 weeks into having these sort of trade discussions in a meaningful way tells you that the offers really have been underwhelming that the Canucks have received. They're not in a position of strength here. Their team has not won back-to-back games since the start of December. JT Miller's underperformed compared certainly to last year when he had 103 points. All of this has been rather messy and public, and you're just not in a spot where you're like, hey, quietly, we're going to make our superstar available. I mean, it feels a little like the Canucks are desperate, right? And so I think there's an outside chance that somehow this doesn't materialize, but there seems to be a recognition here among everyone involved that it's probably best to turn the page, for them to find a deal that makes sense, for them to work under the parameters that JT Miller's provided them in terms of where he wants to play, and see if they can get some harmony behind the scenes, because this has been a very strange year for a team that last year went to Game 7 of the second round. I mean, I don't think too many of us saw the fall off in New York happening with the Rangers, and certainly didn't see the Canucks falling this far, where they're in real danger today of missing the playoffs.
A lot of the smoke recently has been around the Rangers and the Hurricanes with the landing spot for Miller. Do you think it's one of those two teams, or can you envision a scenario where he goes outside of there?
There is a scenario. I think those are the two teams most kind of incentivized to do it, and have had pretty extensive discussions with the Canucks. So it's natural that that's why they're being linked so heavily to this. I mean, in terms of the Rangers, I mean, they made a pitch before Christmas time to get something done. Didn't happen. Obviously, last weekend there was another push to see if there was a way to make this happen, and they weren't able yet to do it. But I do think that both those landing spots make a lot of sense. Now, you do wonder though, does someone else lurking in the weeds here? A team like Dallas, for example, who they're going to be without Tyler Seguin for the remainder of the regular season and have a lot of cap space. Probably haven't performed quite up to their own expectations this season, but still are positioned to be a legit Stanley Cup threat. I mean, initially it didn't make sense for them. Do they circle back? Does a team like St. Louis or someone get in there? I mean, who knows? I don't want to throw too many darts at the dartboard here, because I do think the most palpable discussions have happened with the Rangers and the Hurricanes. I know the Devils have dabbled in this too. So, until it's done, I don't want to say it's got to be one or two teams, but I think those teams make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And the Canucks too, initially they wanted a player for player type of move. It sounds like they've, rethought that position and are at least willing to look at prospects and some other things that I think make that trade make sense. And so, it's up to the Rangers or Hurricanes now to meet that price.
If Miller went to the Stars, that would be. I would love for him to go to the Hurricanes because I love the Hurricanes team this year. But if Miller went to the Stars, they would be. I mean, they already kind of always are right at the top of real cup contenders. But man, he'd be a difference maker there. Of the teams that we see at the top of the standings, whether it's the Capitals or the Knights or whomever, who do you think ends up making the big "I can't believe they pulled that off" move by the deadline?
I mean, the safe money is always on the Golden Knights, isn't it? I mean, it just feels like, and I don't even have the move, like I don't even have the theoretical move to throw out here, but they've sort of, I mean, they've stumbled a little bit of late Vegas, but I mean, let's face it, they've been right near the top of the league all year. I think it's no secret that they're going to get at least one forward before this deadline, if not two, and they are the most creative, ruthless, entertaining. Depends where you sit on the fence in terms of viewing what they do, but they don't hold anything back. I mean, they are truly a cup or bust operation the way they operate. So, I think that they're the most likely to do something that makes us all look twice at our phones and gasp. But this season, I will say the league feels a little more wide open than maybe some years past. I mean, especially on the Eastern Conference side, with respect to what the Capitals have done, and they've raced to the top of the standings. I just don't know that there's one team out there that everyone fears. I do think that there is a bit of a mentality, hey, get in and try to get hot at the right time and go on sort of a run to a cup. So, I would say teams like Tampa, also a pretty aggressive historical team. The Leafs, I think, have a lot of reason to try to do whatever they can. I mean, there's going to be other teams out there that take a swing, but, my money's on Vegas because the smart money is always on the Golden Knights.
Do you have a general sense on like what trade deadline day might look like in terms of busyness? Like, is it going to be a lot of action? Is it going to be disappointing?
I think it has the chance to be very busy just because really we're looking at a 2-week trade period coming out of Four Nations to that deadline. I don't think you're going to see trades happen during the Four Nations. There's no rules against it, but it doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense when your team doesn't play for 8 or 9 or 10 days to make that move, especially because so many teams that make those acquisitions are tight against the cap, and the cap still gets calculated daily during the Four Nations tournament. So basically we have a 2-week window of trades this year. We've already had a fair number of moves in season, but from this point forward, it's basically February 22nd to March 7th is your trade window. And so, I don't know if the minute the Four Nations ends and, Austin Matthews is carrying that trophy around the ice at TD Garden.
Right.
And then if it's going to be a whole bunch of trades in that moment, but if they don't happen right away, then I think you get closer and closer to the actual day having fireworks. So I always cheer for that. I think it's fun if it goes right down to the wire, but let's face it, last year there's some big moves, but most of them happened before the actual day itself.
You mentioned TD Garden. Have you heard anything on Boston as to whether or not, I mean, Frederick obviously is a UFA, not having the best season, but what have you heard on what their plan might be? Because they could potentially have a GM who's GMing for his job, which is always a scary thing.
Well, I know Pete might not want to hear this, but I think they're truly a wild card team, and I don't mean in the sense of chasing a wild card spot. Like, I think it could go both directions. Probably no circumstance they're going to be an aggressive buyer, but if they choose to sell, I mean, what does that look like? Are you actually looking at moving someone like Brad Marchand, who's obviously on an expiring deal? I'm not saying that's likely. In fact, if I had to put odds on that, I'd say it's like 5%. Like, I think it's a real long shot, but do they look at trading even guys like Charlie Coyle, who obviously isn't on an expiring deal, but are they really refreshing the roster, or is it just the Trent Fredericks who are, pure rentals and kind of, I would say, obvious deadline targets? I mean, if they lean into the sell a little bit, they could be one of the most interesting teams at the deadline because they have a lot of attractive, players that could do that. I don't think they've made that decision or that determination internally. I mean, as crazy as it is to say, it probably hinges on what the next 10 to 12, 15 games look like before we get to the end of February. So, it's a different season in Boston. It's certainly been a disappointing year for the organization. And I think that nothing is truly totally off the table when it comes to maybe some significant moves there.
In your mind, does it make sense for them to be in on JT Miller?
Yes. I mean, only because I do think that they lack that, obviously center depth is probably an issue. I know they signed Lindholm in the summer. Just doesn't feel like they're a team that has a true top line center at this point in time. And so it makes some sense, but it would come with some risk because, if it doesn't work, all of a sudden you're acquiring another player who's getting, on the wrong side of 30 that has some cap tied up in him. I just think JT Miller is still good enough that if for some reason that doesn't work, you could probably flip him again. Like even in a year where he's declined, as I mentioned, I mean, he's still a pretty damn good player. And so I think it could be a game changing kind of move, but let's face it, it's the Bruins have held off Father Time for a long time. I mean, they stayed more competitive than I would have thought, seeing it through the Chara years, seeing it through Bergeron. It might be possible they just got to the end for this group. But depending on the price, I would consider at least bringing Miller in to try to keep that window ajar for another season or two.
All right, let's wrap on a little bit of grab ass, because our friend asked us this yesterday, and you being a worldly person might have a good perspective on it. At Four Nations, is a Boston fan allowed to wear an Austin Matthews Maple Leafs jersey to the game?
I'd say yes. I mean, especially if we're talking about a kid, it's because let's face it, it's, just the same way, Connor McDavid, if you're a Canadian, can be a hero of yours, even if you cheer for even the Flames. Let's face it, if you're a 7-year-old kid in Calgary, I don't think there's anything wrong with wearing a McDavid Team Canada jersey. I'd say the same. It's a little bit weirder though if you're an adult, because you have to sort of you have to really rationalize all those things, and I don't even know if from the Boston end of it, guys, is there a rivalry with the Leafs? I mean, they just seem to win every playoff series. So I mean, the Leafs are a team they play with frequency, but I don't even know if we can call it a rivalry from the Boston end.
I'd still call it a rivalry because it's a close series every time, and they're hateable. So it's still a rivalry in my mind. My answer to the question that was posed by our friend was, I wouldn't violate like your personal moral code for jersey approach. Like, I wouldn't wear a Leafs jersey anytime, like outside of Four Nations. So I'm not going to wear an Austin Matthews Leafs jersey to Four Nations to support Austin Matthews. Like, right. I think that if you want to go for the USA jersey or the national jersey of that player, it's all on the table. But don't violate like your personal code of like the favorite team that you root for.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's funny. I have a nephew who's a big Senators fan. He lives in Ottawa, and I tried to get him a McDavid Four Nations jersey for Christmas. Unfortunately, they weren't for sale yet, so I was unsuccessful in my efforts to do that. But I thought, even for a kid who doesn't cheer for McDavid, I mean, pretty badass to have that jersey. So I'll have to get it for him when I get to that tournament in Montreal.
Yeah, I think that this tournament is going to be fantastic for people watching. You're going to see, it's just going to be weird being at TD Garden and seeing an Islanders jersey and a Wild jersey. It's just going to be an absolute mess, and I can't wait for it. You're like into the Four Nations thing, right?
I am. I've been like a lot of the players. I've just been dying to see the concept back. I realize this isn't the same as the Olympics. I'm going into it a little bit open-minded. Like, are the players going to care? Like, that's the thing I'm most interested in. Probably for that first Saturday in Montreal when you have Sweden, Finland, and Canada, US back to back. Like, because each team, of course, will have played a game by then, and those are sort of quote unquote rivalry games by nations. Like, I'm curious to see, are the guys hitting? Are they invested? And I do think obviously this is sort of the beginning to the run up to the 2026 Olympics, which is going to look more like true best on best.
Are you going to be at these games?
I will be at every one of them.
Oh, so, excellent.
Hell yeah.
Well,
Canada, Finland on a Monday afternoon in Boston. I don't know if it'll be us and our closest friends at that game or what, but
so
I'm excited.
We can tease now. We're doing an event for that game, so you'll across the street. So you'll have to be there after. Come grab a drink, do whatever. It'll be an absolute blast. We can't wait to see you. Chris Johnston, you're the best.
All right, guys. See you soon.
We all silly like the mayor.